She trusted him as a father her whole life, until the day she realized that the love protecting her was the same love that had already decided to own her forever. She remembered her childhood as a place of warmth, not because it truly was, but because that was how it had been carefully painted for her. The house always smelled of old wood and evening tea, and the walls carried framed photographs that told a story of respectability, smiling faces, pressed clothes, a family that looked whole. As a little girl, she believed those pictures were proof that nothing bad could ever touch her. She believed the man she called her father was the strongest person in the world, not because he raised his voice or demanded obedience, but because he never seemed to let harm come near her. When she tripped and scraped her knees, he was there. When she cried at night, afraid of shadows that lived only in her imagination, his presence chased them away. In her young mind, safety had his face. He was careful in the way he built that trust. Every gesture was deliberate, every word measured. He praised her intelligence, her beauty, her obedience, wrapping his approval around her like a blanket. To a child, attention feels like love, and love feels like protection. She did not know that protection can sometimes be a cage built slowly, bar by invisible bar. She only knew that when he entered the room, she felt seen, important, chosen, and for a child who wanted nothing more than to belong, that feeling was intoxicating. Her mother existed in the background, a quiet figure moving through the house like a shadow that had learned not to interrupt the light. She cooked, cleaned, and nodded when spoken to, but rarely challenged anything. When the girl looked to her for reassurance, she often found tired eyes and half smiles, as if the woman herself had learned long ago that questions were dangerous. The absence of protest taught the child something without words. Whatever happened in this house was normal, and whatever felt confusing was best kept silent. Days passed in routines that seemed harmless. School, homework, dinner, sleep. But within those routines were subtle shifts she couldn't name at the time. He insisted on walking her to places she once went alone. He discouraged friendships that might pull her attention outward. He spoke of the world as a cruel place, full of people who would misunderstand her, hurt her, use her. "Only family truly cares," he would say, his voice calm, convincing. Each warning sounded like wisdom, and she absorbed it without resistance. Why would she doubt the man who had never let her fall? At night, she would lie in bed listening to the house breathe, the creak of settling wood, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rhythm of her own heartbeat. Sometimes she felt a strange heaviness she could not explain, a sense that something in her world was slightly off balance. But children are experts at normalizing discomfort. When something feels wrong but has always been that way, the mind learns to smooth over the cracks. She told herself she was lucky. Other children complained about strict parents or cold homes. She had a father who cared deeply, who worried, who watched. He taught her what to say and how to say it. He corrected the way she dressed, the way she laughed, the way she looked at others. All of it was framed as guidance, as love meant to prepare her for a harsh world. "I only want what's best for you," he would remind her, often enough that the sentence became a truth she never questioned. Over time, his voice grew louder in her mind than her own. When she felt uncertain, she asked herself what he would think, what he would approve of. That internal echo was the real mark of control, though she wouldn't recognize it until much later. There were moments of genuine tenderness, too, and those moments confused her the most. He celebrated her small achievements with pride that made her glow. He defended her fiercely when others criticized her. In those moments she felt deeply loved, and love has a way of blinding us to everything else. The human heart is not built to hold suspicion alongside affection, especially not in childhood. So she chose affection again and again because it felt safer than doubt. As the years passed, her world remained small by design. The house was not a prison with locked doors, but it functioned like one all the same. Her sense of right and wrong, of normal and abnormal, was shaped entirely within its walls. She didn't know that families elsewhere spoke openly, argued freely, allowed children to grow without fear of disapproval. She knew only this version of life, where love was intense, watchful, and conditional. where praise came easily, but independence felt like betrayal. Sometimes she wondered why she felt guilty for wanting simple things, privacy, space, opinions of her own. The guilt would arrive suddenly, heavy and irrational, and she would push it down, telling herself she was being ungrateful. After all, she had been given everything she needed: food, shelter, attention. Wasn't that what love was? The question lingered in her mind, unanswered, like a whisper she was afraid to follow. What made the bond truly dangerous was not cruelty, but consistency. He was always there, always watching, always shaping her understanding of herself and the world. There were no dramatic moments to point to, no single event she could label as wrong. Instead, there was a slow erosion of boundaries she didn't yet know she was allowed to have. A quiet rewriting of roles that would only become clear much later, when the cost of that trust could no longer be ignored. By the time she reached the edge of adolescence, she carried a deep, unspoken belief. Her life belonged to her family, and her family belonged to him. The idea felt natural, inevitable, even comforting. She did not yet know that this belief was the foundation of something deeply forbidden. She did not yet know that the same trust that made her feel safe as a child would one day trap her in a role she never chose. And so the story begins not with rebellion or fear, but with innocence, pure, unquestioning, and carefully guided. Because the most disturbing stories are not born from obvious evil, but from love that wears the wrong face, and protection that slowly becomes possession. As she grew older, the rhythm of her life began to change in ways so subtle that she didn't notice them at first. Childhood does not end with a clear sound. It fades, quietly, like daylight slipping out of a room. The man she trusted sensed that change before she did. Where once his guidance had felt gentle, it now carried weight. Where once his concern had felt protective, it began to feel absolute. He watched more closely, listened more carefully, and corrected more often. It was never framed as control, it was always concern, always love. He started deciding what was appropriate for her age and what was not, even when others disagreed. Clothes were chosen carefully, not for comfort or expression, but for modesty that went beyond reason. Conversations with boys were discouraged, then forbidden. Friendships with girls were monitored, questioned, slowly thinned out. Each restriction came with a warning about danger, about reputation, about how easily a girl's life could be ruined. Fear was introduced gently, like a lesson meant to protect, and she absorbed it without resistance. She noticed that doors were knocked on less often, that privacy became something she had to earn, and even then, it was fragile. Questions about her thoughts, her feelings, her day grew more detailed, more invasive. At first she answered openly, believing transparency was proof of trust. Over time she learned to measure her words, to anticipate which answers would bring approval and which would invite disappointment. Silence became safer than honesty, and obedience easier than explanatio. The house itself seemed to shrink. Rooms that once felt open now felt watched. The air carried a quiet tension she could not name. She became hyper-aware of footsteps in the hallway, of pauses outside her door, of the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Nothing obvious happened, nothing she could point to and say, "This is where it changed." And yet, everything had changed. He spoke often of sacrifice, of how much he had given up for his family, of how deeply he loved her compared to a world that would never understand her worth. His words wrapped around her like a script she was expected to memorize. When she hesitated, when she expressed confusion, his disappointment was immediate and devastating. Not anger, something far worse. Silence, distance, the withdrawal of warmth. She learned quickly that compliance brought affection, and resistance brought loneliness. Her mother's presence grew even quieter. When the girl sought her eyes for reassurance, she found avoidance instead. There were moments when their gazes met and something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of fear, maybe regret, but it was never acknowledged. The lack of protection hurt more than open cruelty would have. It taught her that this was something she was meant to endure alone. As adolescence deepened, his attention intensified. He commented on changes in her appearance, with a seriousness that unsettled her. Compliments felt heavy, layered with expectation, boundaries blurred in ways he didn't have the language to describe. She felt wrong for feeling uncomfortable, convinced that the discomfort meant she was misunderstanding something pure. After all, this was family. Family meant safety. Family meant trust. She told herself that again and again, forcing the feeling to settle. Isolation did the rest. Without friends to compare experiences with, without an outside voice to say this isn't normal, her reality became the only reality. He positioned himself as the sole interpreter of the world, the only one who truly knew what was best for her. When she questioned herself, he provided answers. When she doubted, he offered certainty. Over time, her independence weakened, replaced by reliance so deep it felt like survival. She began to feel as though she owed him something she couldn't quite define, a debt made of gratitude, loyalty, and fear. When she imagined a future that did not include his approval, panic rose in her chest. The thought of disappointing him felt unbearable, worse than the thought of losing herself. That was the moment protection fully turned into possession, not through force but through belief. Nights became the hardest. Alone with her thoughts, she replayed conversations, gestures, looks. She tried to sort through what felt wrong and what felt familiar, but the lines were too tangled. Guilt crept in whenever doubt appeared. She blamed herself for not being grateful enough, obedient enough, loving enough. The idea that something was done to her never fully formed. Instead, she believed she was failing at being the daughter he needed. The outside world faded further into the background. School became a place she attended physically but left emotionally untouched. Teachers' concerns were dismissed. Invitations were declined on her behalf. Slowly, quietly, her life narrowed until it existed almost entirely within the orbit of one person. And within that orbit, his gravity was absolute. What made it all so effective was that there was still kindness, still laughter at times, still moments where he seemed proud, affectionate, almost gentle. Those moments acted like anchors, pulling her back whenever her instincts tried to drift toward doubt. She clung to them, using them as proof that everything was fine, that she was safe, that she was loved. But love that demands silence is not love, and protection that erases choice is not protection. Even if she couldn't name it yet, something inside her began to fracture. A quiet awareness, buried deep, started to whisper that this closeness was not meant to feel like this. That fear should not live where love is supposed to grow. She did not rebel, she did not run, she adapted. And in doing so, she stepped further into a role she never agreed to play. The child who once trusted without fear was still there, but now she was carrying confusion, guilt, and a loyalty that was slowly consuming her. The transformation was complete, not with violence or spectacle, but wit. Patience, manipulation, and time. By the time she realized how tightly her life was being held, the hands around it felt familiar enough to be mistaken for care. And that familiarity would soon be used to justify something far darker than control. The announcement did not come suddenly, though it felt like a shock that stole the air from her lungs. It arrived the way everything else had in her life, carefully prepared, wrapped in certainty, delivered as if there were no alternative. She was sitting across from him in the familiar living room, the same room where she had once done homework at his feet, the same room where she had learned what approval felt like and what silence could punish. The light was soft, evening settling into the corners of the house, and for a moment she thought this would be another lecture about duty, another reminder of gratitude. She was not prepared for how completely her world would shift. He spoke calmly, confidently, as if explaining something that had always been inevitable. He talked about responsibility, about family honor, about how outsiders could never understand what they shared. His words flowed with rehearsed ease, each sentence designed to sound reasonable, protective, even noble. He did not ask her what she wanted. He told her what would happen. And the most terrifying part was not the decision itself, but the way it was presented as love. Her mind resisted at first, recoiling from the meaning beneath his words. She felt a rush of heat, confusion tightening around her chest. This was not something that existed in her understanding of the world. It violated every quiet instinct she had learned to ignore. And yet, even in that moment, she searched his face for reassurance, for some sign that she had misunderstood. She did not find it. What she found instead was expectation. He explained that this union would protect her, that it would keep her safe from judgment, from abandonment, from a world that would only harm her. He framed it as a sacrifice on his part, something he was willing to endure for the sake of family. The narrative was twisted so completely that refusal felt like betrayal. Her thoughts spiraled, but her voice remained trapped somewhere deep inside her, buried under years of conditioning that told her obedience was survival. When she tried to speak, the words came out fractured, uncertain. He responded, not with anger, but with disappointment so heavy it crushed her resolve. He reminded her of everything he had done for her, everything he had given up. He spoke of loyalty as if it were a debt she owed, and of love as if it required surrender. Slowly, relentlessly, the space for refusal disappeared. The days that followed felt unreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Conversations happened around her, plans were made without her participation, decisions sealed before she could process them. Her mother avoided her gaze more than ever now, moving through the house like a ghost bound by fear and habit. There was no confrontation, no dramatic argument, just quiet compliance, as if the house itself had accepted this fate long ago. She was told how to behave, how to speak, how to present herself. The rules shifted again, tightening into something more suffocating. She felt herself being transformed from a daughter into something else, though the role was never named openly. The duality was unbearable. One moment she was reminded of her obedience as a child, the next she was expected to step into a future that made her stomach turn with dread. The contradiction fractured her sense of self, leaving her unsure of who she was supposed to be. As the day approached, the weight of it pressed down on her relentlessly. Sleep became shallow, haunted by dreams she couldn't remember but woke from shaking. She moved through her days in a fog, performing tasks automatically, nodding when spoken to, smiling when expected. Inside, panic churned, but there was nowhere to release it. There was no language in her world for protest, no safe place for truth. The ceremony itself was a blur of faces and forced normalcy. People gathered, offering congratulations, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the horror beneath the surface. She stood dressed for a role she never chose, her body present while her mind retreated inward for survival. The words spoken around her felt distant, distorted, like echoes underwater. When vows were exchanged, they sounded less like promise, and more like a sentence being carried out. She felt a strange dissociation as it happened, as if separating from her body was the only way to endure. Her hands were steady, her expression composed, because that was what was required. Inside she was screaming, but the scream had no sound, no shape, no witness. The man she once called her father stood beside her, transformed by declaration into something else, though the power dynamic remained exactly the same. If anything, it was now legally sealed. Afterward, the house felt different. Familiar spaces took on new meaning, heavier, more oppressive. The air itself seemed to judge her. She no longer knew where she belonged within those walls, only that escape felt impossible. Every movement was watched, every emotion measured. She existed in a state of constant tension, trying to reconcile the past with the present, trying to understand how trust had led her here. Shame wrapped around her like a second skin, though she could not fully explain why she felt it. She had been taught that this was right, necessary, protective, and yet something deep within her resisted, aching with a truth she had never been allowed to voice. That internal conflict became her constant companion, a silent war between what she was told to believe and what her body knew. What made it unbearable was the expectation of gratitude. She was praised for her composure, her obedience, her maturity. Each compliment felt like an accusation. She learned to nod, to accept approval she did not want, to perform a happiness that did not exist. The world saw a union. She lived a captivity. Time passed, but the shock never fully faded. Each day layered new confusion onto old wounds. She was trapped in a role that erased her past and controlled her future, bound by law, fear, and silence. The marriage was not the beginning of something new, it was the confirmation of something that had been building for years. A possession made official, a boundary crossed beyond repair. And still, the most haunting part was not the ceremony, not the words spoken aloud, but the realization that no one had asked her what she wanted. Not once. Her voice had been removed so thoroughly that its absence went unnoticed. The child who once trusted without fear was gone now, replaced by someone who understood too late that love, when twisted by power, can become the most effective prison of all. After the marriage, life did not explode into chaos the way she once imagined trauma might. There were no screams echoing through the house, no dramatic confrontations, no visible bruises to confirm that something was wrong. Instead, there was something far more damaging: normalcy. A carefully maintained routine that demanded she continue living as if nothing had changed, while everything inside her had been irrevocably altered. The house looked the same. The furniture sat where it always had. But every familiar object now carried a different weight, as if the walls themselves were aware of the secret they held. She woke each morning unsure of who she was supposed to be. Some days she was expected to act like the daughter she had always been, quiet, respectful, obedient. Other days she was reminded of her new role, one that felt alien and suffocating. The transition between the two was never acknowledged, never explained. It simply existed, forcing her to adapt without understanding. That confusion hollowed her out. When identity fractures, survival becomes a performance. Shame settled into her bones slowly, like a sickness that didn't announce itself but steadily drained her strength. It wasn't just shame about what had happened. It was shame for how little she resisted, for how quickly she learned to comply. She told herself she should have fought harder, spoken louder, run sooner. That self-blame became a weapon turned inward, one that punished her long after the moment had passed. She carried it silently, convinced that if she were stronger, smarter, braver, things might have been different. The silence in the house was deliberate. Nothing was discussed openly. Questions were unwelcome. Emotions were inconvenient. When she showed signs of distress, she was reminded of her duty, of loyalty, of gratitude. The language of control never changed, it simply adapted. Where once it had spoken of protection, now it spoke of obligation. Where once it promised safety, now it demanded endurance. Love, she was told, meant sacrifice, and sacrifice, she learned, meant herself. Her mother became a source of quiet agony. They passed each other in hallways, shared meals at the same table, existed in the same space without ever truly meeting. On rare occasions, their eyes locked, and in those moments, the truth hovered between them like a fragile thing neither dared to touch. There was fear there, regret, helplessness, but no intervention, no rescue. The absence of action screamed louder than words ever could. It taught her that even those who see the truth may choose silence over risk. The outside world continued to exist, indifferent to her suffering. People smiled at her, spoke kindly, congratulated her on her life. Their ignorance made her feel invisible. She learned how to respond with practiced ease, how to mask pain behind politeness. Every interaction became an act, every smile a lie. The effort it took to maintain that facade was exhausting, but it felt safer than honesty. Truth in her world was dangerous. Nights were the worst. When the house grew quiet and the distractions faded, her thoughts became louder, memories tangled with fear, guilt with anger. She replayed moments from her childhood, searching for signs she might have missed, wondering when exactly things went wrong. But there was no single moment to point to, no clear line between before and after. That ambiguity tormented her. It made the pain harder to justify, easier to dismiss. She felt trapped not just by circumstances but by her own conditioning. Even when she imagined escape, her mind flooded with questions that paralyzed her. Where would she go? Who would believe her? What if she destroyed her family by speaking out? The fear of consequences outweighed the hope of freedom. That fear had been planted early, nurtured carefully, and now it controlled her completely. Her body began to react in ways her mind could not explain. Sleeplessness, sudden waves of panic, a constant tension that never fully released. She felt disconnected from herself, as if she were observing her life from a distance. Dissociation became a refuge, a way to survive moments that felt unbearable. Each time she retreated inward, it became a little easier to disappear. Despite everything, there were moments when anger surfaced. Sharp, frightening, alive. It startled her, because anger felt forbidden. She had been taught that anger was disrespectful, dangerous, selfish, but it came anyway, burning quietly beneath the surface. She directed it at herself most of the time, but sometimes in fleeting moments of clarity, she recognized its true source. Those moments scared her because they threatened the fragile balance she depended on to endure. Time moved forward, whether she wanted it to or not. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. The routine became predictable, and predictability, in its own twisted way, felt safe. She learned how to anticipate expectations, how to avoid conflict, how to disappear without leaving. Survival became a primary skill. Not living, surviving. What haunted her most was the loss of choice. Every aspect of her life felt predetermined, decided by someone else. Even her emotions felt regulated, allowed only within strict limits. She longed for a moment of genuine freedom, even if it came with pain, but longing too felt dangerous. Wanting something different implied that her current reality was wrong, and acknowledging that truth felt like standing on the edge of collapse. There were moments when she wondered if this was all there would ever be, if this quiet suffering was her permanent state. The thought terrified her, but it also numbed her. Hope became something she rationed carefully, afraid that too much of it would make reality unbearable. So she lived in a narrow emotional range, just wide enough to function, just small enough to survive. Yet deep within her, something refused to die completely. A faint awareness that what she was enduring was not normal, not justified, not deserved. It whispered when everything else was silent, reminding her that her pain had a cause, and that cause was not her existence. She didn't yet know what she would do with that awareness. She only knew it existed. And that quiet awareness, buried beneath shame, fear, and silence, was the most dangerous thing of all. Because once a truth is recognized, even faintly, it cannot be entirely erased. It waits, it grows, and eventually it demands to be heard. The truth did not arrive like a thunder clap. It crept in slowly, carried on exhaustion, on cracks that could no longer be hidden beneath routine and silence. For a long time she had survived by shrinking herself, by becoming small enough to fit inside the life that had been built around her without consent. But survival has limits, and one day, without warning, her body and mind reached theirs. It began with a moment so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. A conversation overheard, a question asked by someone who did not know they were touching a forbidden edge, a look held just a second too long. Something shifted inside her, not fear this time, but clarity, the kind that feels sharp and terrifying because it cannot be undone. For the first time, she allowed herself to think the unthinkable. This was wrong. Not confusing, not complicated, wrong. That realization did not bring immediate courage. It brought terror. Because once the truth had a name, it demanded consequences, it demanded choice. And choice had been stripped from her for so long that reclaiming it felt like stepping into fire. She tried at first to push the thought away, to return to the numbness that had kept her functional, but the truth was patient. It waited in the quiet moments, in the pauses between breaths, in the mirror when she could no longer recognize the person staring back. The cracks began to show outwardly. She became distant, distracted, less compliant. Small changes, but enough to disturb the fragile order of the house. Questions followed. Pressure increased. The familiar tactics returned: guilt, obligation, reminders of loyalty and family honor. But something had changed in her. The words no longer settled the way they once did. They scraped instead, burned. She realized then that silence had never truly protected her. It had only protected the lie. The first time she spoke the truth aloud, it barely sounded like her own voice. It came out trembling, fragmented, wrapped in apologies that did not belong to her. She didn't tell the whole story. She couldn't. She offered pieces, testing whether the world would collapse if she let them go. She expected disbelief, anger, rejection. What she did not expect was stillness, the kind that happens when someone understands the gravity of what they are hearing. That moment changed everything. Once spoken, the truth began to move faster than she was ready for. It passed from one set of ears to another, gaining weight with each telling. The family's carefully constructed image began to fracture. Whispers replaced praise, questions replaced certainty. The house that had once enforced silence now trembled under scrutiny, and for the first time she was no longer alone in knowing. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like she had imagined. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden remorse. There was denial, anger, attempts to rewrite reality. He spoke of misunderstanding, of tradition, of sacrifice. He accused her of betrayal, of ingratitude, of destroying the family. The words were sharp, familiar, designed to wound. But this time they did not land the same way, because they were no longer the only story being told. She watched the illusion collapse piece by piece, not quickly, not cleanly, but irreversibly. Authority lost its power when exposed to light. Control weakened when others began asking questions he could not silence. The truth, once hidden, proved stronger than fear. The aftermath was not relief, it was chaos. She faced consequences she had been warned about all her life: judgment, gossip, division. Some people turned away, choosing comfort over truth. Others looked at her with pity she did not want. But there were also those who believed her, who stood beside her without asking her to justify her pain. That support felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Trust had been dangerous for so long that kindness felt like a test. Healing did not begin immediately. In many ways, the hardest part came after the truth was known, when survival was no longer the only goal, and she had to confront what had been done to her without the shield of numbness. Grief arrived then, raw and overwhelming. Grief for the childhood she never had, for the safety that had been an illusion, for the person she might have been. She learned that justice is not always satisfying. Sometimes it is incomplete, sometimes it is slow, sometimes it looks nothing like closure. But accountability, even imperfect, mattered. Naming what happened mattered. Refusing to carry shame that was never hers mattered. The family never returned to what it had been. It couldn't. Some bonds broke permanently, others changed beyond recognition. That loss hurt more than she expected. Even when relationships are built on harm, losing them feels like losing gravity. She had to learn how to exist without the structure that had defined her entire life. Freedom was not immediate joy, it was disorientation, silence that no longer felt enforced, but empty. Decisions that no one else made for her, a future that was suddenly unwritten. She struggled with that openness, with the responsibility of choosing for herself. But slowly, painfully, she began to understand that this uncertainty was not a threat, it was possibility. She started with small things, choosing where to go, what to wear, what she liked, relearning her own voice. Therapy gave language to experiences she had never been allowed to describe. Each word reclaimed felt like oxygen. Each boundary set felt like an act of rebellion against a past that no longer controlled her. There were setbacks, nights when memories returned without warning, days when anger resurfaced, sharp and consuming. Healing was linear, but it was hers. For the first time, the process belonged to her, not to someone else's expectations. What stayed with her most was the understanding that the truth had not destroyed her family. Silence had, power had, fear had. The truth had only revealed what was already broken. In time, she stopped defining herself by what had been done to her. The story did not disappear, but it stopped being the only thing she was. She became more than survival, more than endurance, more than a role forced upon her before she understood what choice meant. And though the past could never be rewritten, the future finally could. The forbidden bond that once controlled her life lost its power the moment it was named. Not because speaking erased the pain, but because silence no longer owned her. And that, in the end, was the breaking of the curse.